matters. The topic for today is persistent complement dysregulation with signs of thromboinflammation in active long COVID. So we've been waiting for this study, and you know that society as a whole has moved on from the pandemic, they say. However, for those with long COVID, the suffering continues. The world scientific community is trying to find a way to help. So, Dr. Gonshor, you may take it away.
Well, in each of these sessions, I always say that we take a deep dive into recent research that brings to light objective scientific evidence on the topic of hand. And if there was anything that is recent, it's COVID and what's happening literally to this date as we speak with these poor people who are suffering from long COVID. So today, let's look more closely at the topic of what happens to these people with long COVID. This study, which Reed mentioned, like many others, is attempting, desperately trying to find what fundamental derangement in the body can explain the myriad of symptoms and clinical dysfunction that we call long COVID. This study looks closely at an immune response derangement. So with that in mind, let's look at the actual evidence because, Reed,
Science matters. So thank you, Dr. Gonshor. After our last broadcast, which was titled The Microbiome Gut-Brain Axis Regulates Social Cognition and Craving in Young Binge Drinkers, great program. If you missed it, go back and watch that. There were some questions that came to our attention. And one of the questions was, Dr. Gonshor, can you delve more deeply into how alcohol affects the gut microbiome and by extension, other organs of the body?
well, Reed, alcohol and the products of its degradation by the human organism, because it has to get degraded, right, can strongly modulate the human gut microbiome. And there were some of the questions that came in. They said, yeah, well, of course. Well, the of course is that we're really trying to get a handle on the specifics of what it's doing. So moreover, the resulting gut dysbiosis contributes to neuroinflammation. And that neuroinflammatory response can be pretty significant, folks. So that is due to alcohol exposure and withdrawal and doing this multiple times, leading to psychiatric symptoms of alcoholism. However, most of the studies of alcohol dependence syndrome, ADS, and there is a syndrome like that, are focused on examining its actions on the functions of the liver and other organs. That's what we normally talk about, right? We say, oh yeah, it affects the liver, which it does. While the question of how this alcohol dependence impacts the gut microbiota has to a large extent been unexplored. So now it's changing, and rightfully so. It should be changing. Recent studies are showing that this dependence syndrome is associated with a decreased abundance of the major commensal microbiota taxa. So some of those commensals, which we know we need, they're starting to be disrupted, including the big favorites, Bacteroides, Lactinospiraceae. I mean, all of these ones that we know very well are being affected. The result, inflammation and increased intestinal permeability, what you don't want. So alcoholism is commonly accompanied by a number of pathologies, each of which can individually shift the composition of the gut microbiota. And every time you shift, you run into a problem. And that contributes to the pathogenesis of various liver diseases, such as alcoholic liver cirrhosis, ALC, which develops in about 10 or 15% of alcoholics. Not a small point, by the way. So a growing number of recent studies support the hypothesis that the gut microbiota can play a significant role in the onset and the progression of alcohol liver disease, as well as non-alcoholic fat liver disease and other liver dysfunctions. There is a definite connection, and that's now being established.
Dr. Gonshor, that's great. Would you indulge me in one more question, please? And that is that this idea of alcoholism, I think, the studies showed that it was the binge drinking, which was drinking 4 ounces of alcohol within 2 hours for women and 5 ounces of alcohol within 2 hours for
They didn't
men.
say ounces. They didn't say ounces. They said drinks. They didn't say the amount of ounces. I'd have to actually check that.
Okay, drinks, generally, okay. So, fair enough. At what point are you considered ADS if you do, like, do you have to do that 3 times a week, 5 times a week? Or is drinking just 2 glasses of wine per day considered alcohol dependent? I would contend that it, to some degree, becomes a very hard habit to break. But do you have any data on what, because I know someone's gonna ask, what makes you an alcoholic? Where's that level, or is it individualized? Depends on the person.
Oh, it depends on the person. It depends on genetics and so on. There are a whole number of things that affect it. In that particular study, which I don't have here in front of me, but in
Right,
that
yeah,
particular study, they definitely went up to at least 4 or 5 drinks. I would submit, even though 2 drinks can have an issue for some people,
yeah,
they went way above that. And I believe what they were taking is the standard that is used in a lot of research to say, we want to make sure that we are getting individuals taking enough alcohol, that there is absolutely no question that it can affect a series of organs, because they can take a look at the metabolic chain that takes place. And that needs more than just 1 or 2 drinks. I can agree with you that there's some people where they take 1 or 2 drinks and they're in trouble because their genetic makeup doesn't allow their system to be able to handle that in a way which will keep them free of developing a habit, an alcoholic habit, because
yeah.
alcoholism involves habitual use, the habit of use.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, thank you for that, and thanks to everyone for submitting your questions. Very important to all of us as we learn together. And thanks again, Dr. Gonshor, for indulging us in the Q&A part of this shows. Let's jump into today's study about persistent complement dysregulation with signs of thromboinflammation in active long COVID.
Welcome. So today we are going to discuss persistent complement dysregulation with signs of thromboinflammation in active long COVID. So those are 2 interesting issues. And this is a long study and actually quite well written. And you can see a lot of people involved in this. And what they were saying is that active long COVID is marked by a number of things, by increased complement activation and thromboinflammation, including activated platelets and markers of red blood cell lysis. Tissue injury may also lead to the activation of the complement system. So before we do that, a number of months ago, we did another one of our broadcasts in which we looked at long COVID. And at that time, we were looking at the effect on the mitochondria. And for those of you who didn't see it, I don't know exactly when, but you can go back to the list and you'll see that study. And what they showed is that mitochondrial genes can be negatively affected and impacted by SARS-CoV-2, leading to dysfunction in multiple organs beyond the lungs. Because remember, the whole idea was the lungs were what was being affected. And the answer is no, it's more than the lungs. It's all the organs of the body, depending on the individual. So that COVID-19 at that time was shown not strictly to be an upper respiratory disease, but rather a systemic disorder. that impacts multiple organs. And in that study, they showed that neutralizing microRNA 2392, and we're not going to go into what that is, but it's a specific entity, might impede viral replication and provide a therapeutic option for patients at risk for more serious complications. So they were saying that this particular microRNA is upregulated in blood of patients who are infected with SARS-CoV-2. That's not what you would have normally expected. So if you can decrease that, you would decrease the effect that it's having on the mitochondria. But today we're looking at a totally different aspect that may be affected. And what is it? It's the complement system. And the complement system is a parallel immunology system in the body, an immunological pathway or pathways that control the way in which our immunology works in our bodies. And there are actually three distinct pathways. I'm not going to go through it in detail. There's the classical pathway, which is the important one, really, and it's triggered by IgG or IgM antibody antigen complexes. And as soon as the complex is formed, it goes through a cascade of pathways that will lead to a very robust immunological reaction. There's the alternative pathway, which I'm not going to go into detail, nor will I go into detail on the lectin pathway, which is a recognition of specific carbohydrates on microbial surfaces. The important thing is to remember that this particular group of pathways, which is called the complement system, is a critical way in which the body controls the immunological response. So in this case, we're looking at complement activation and thromboinflammation. Well, approximately 5% of all infected individuals with COVID do not recover from the acute COVID-2 infection. So there's the acute infection, and then these people continue with long-term complications, which we have given a term long COVID. The current hypotheses on factors that contribute to long COVID include tissue damage of various kinds, viral reservoirs holding on to this virus in various areas of the body. It doesn't quite leave entirely, or portions of it don't leave, autoimmunity, which it can cause, and persistent inflammation. And there are currently no diagnostic tests or therapeutic solutions for these unfortunate people. So in this study, what they did is they followed 39 healthy controls and 113 COVID patients, and they followed them for 1 year after the initial confirmation of the acute COVID infection to identify biomarkers that might be associated with long COVID, because that's one of the things that you want to find. Are there biomarkers? And at the 6-month follow-up, 40 of these patients had long COVID symptoms. And they repeated clinical assessments, and they were paired with blood draws, and they did 268 blood samples. And in that, they measured over 6,500 proteins in the serum utilizing modern proteomic analyses. And top candidate biomarkers were identified using computational tools. By the way, they used AI as well, and further evaluated experimentally. So what did they find in doing all of this? What they found is long COVID patients exhibited increased complement activation. And remember, we use the word complement. It's not a compliment to have complement. Complement is an immune issue, and there was increased immune activation during the acute disease, which then persisted at a 6-month follow-up. And they also found that the blood complement levels began to normalize in these long COVID patients that were recovering before their 6-month follow-up. So there was already a recovery in many of them at the 6-month follow-up. The complement system, we know, can be activated by various triggers, resulting in the formation of what is called terminal complement complex. And what is that? That is an actual complex of the various pieces that make up this pathway, this complement pathway, which gets itself integrated into cell membranes. And by doing that, these components of the complement system that attach to these cell membranes will induce cell activation or lysis. So you can destroy the cell by this activation. And long COVID patients showed an imbalanced terminal complement complex formation. And how? By a marked increase in these complexes, suggesting that the increased membrane insertion of these complexes in the cells of these long COVID patients contributed to tissue damage because they had more of this complex attaching to the membranes, more cells died. And if the cells are dying, what are you seeing? Tissue damage. So the findings were that long COVID patients showed elevated tissue injury and markers in blood and a thromboinflammatory signature. That's interesting, was characterized by markers of endothelial activation. So something was happening within the blood vessels themselves. Those blood vessels started to get various factors going up, like 1-Willebrons and red blood cell lysis. So red blood cells were dying within the blood vessels, and somehow you started to get an activation of the endothelial layer, the membrane layer of the blood cell region. Elevated platelet activation markers and monocyte platelet aggregation at 6-month follow-up. Also, particular cases where long COVID persisted for greater than 12 months. So not only was there endothelial activation due to inflammation, but they were also seeing changes in platelet activation, which will cause clots. So these patients showed signs of antibody-mediated activation of the classical complement pathway. Remember, there are 3 pathways making up the complement, but this was the classical pathway. So what are some of the conclusions? Active long COVID is accompanied by a blood protein signature that is marked by increased complement activation and thromboinflammation. Remember, thrombo, clot, closure of the blood vessel, and inflammation, including activated platelets and markers of red blood cell lysis. And that's what's causing the thromboinflammation. Complement activation may be driven by antigen-antibody complexes involving autoantibodies, which, by the way, you normally don't see that much of, and antibodies against herpes viruses, of all things, as well as crosstalk with a dysregulated coagulation system. So something is really going on here that is causing the coagulation system to become dysregulated. In addition to offering a basis for new diagnostic solutions, this study provides support for clinical research on complement modulators for patients suffering from long COVID. So what they're saying is, what we really should be doing is immediately utilizing modulators of the complement system on these patients, recognizing that almost surely they are having problems with their complement system. Thank you.
Another great one in the books, Dr. Gonshor. Thank you so much. For everybody else, please subscribe, like, and share if you enjoyed this episode. And submit your questions, comments, and suggested topics, please. And grab a copy of the studies at fdntraining.com/studies. And today's world, propelled by science and technology, understanding the fundamental principles of science is no longer just an advantage, it's a necessity. And to thrive in tomorrow's world, we suggest you become equipped not just with scientific knowledge, but with the ability to critically engage. So grab the scientific literacy course offered by FDN at fdntraining.com/smliteracy. And join us again in 2 weeks on June 12th, when we'll talk about blood pressure effects on sodium reduction. And why, Dr. Gonshor?
Because science matters.